Hi folks, Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about Queen Elizabeth I of England, who came to the throne around 1560 and died, I think it was 1603. So over 40 years on the throne of England. And during that time, English seafarers and traders were establishing trading posts, in the Caribbean and also in what today in the United States is called Virginia. It was named after Queen Elizabeth, and they were looking at setting up plantations, things like sugar and tobacco and all that sort of stuff, cotton later on. So let's just have a look, because there's a lot of articles doing the rounds now where the feminists and the globalists are all prepared to attack every male British hero, but they're very reluctant to attack or to cast any negative light Queen Elizabeth I from the 1500s. So we're talking 500 years ago. Now, Queen Elizabeth came to the throne in rather unusual circumstances and in unusual conditions. There was a lot of geopolitical shifts around in Europe at the time, which England did benefit from quite considerably. So we'll have a little look at them. But the feminist position is that she was the best monarch that was ever existed, that because of her, Britain or England entered a golden age where just everything was perfect and the sun never stopped shining, the sky was always blue, and so on and so forth. Now, this is, of course, absolute and utter nonsense. But let's have a look at it, because Queen Elizabeth I, again from 500 years ago, is touted as a feminist icon, an example of a strong woman who don't need no man, and so on. So let's have a little look. Now, Elizabeth was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, that was Henry VIII's second wife. And Anne Boleyn was beheaded on the orders of the king for allegedly engaging in affairs with other men, and adulterous affairs with other men, and so she's put to death. To what extent that was true is a little bit harder. The evidence is, the probability is there, but it's still sketchy. They hardly nailed it down tight, but the king wanted to move on and marry someone else, and in the hope of producing an heir. So anyway, she was her head was chopped off. Now, she was a master schemer and treacherous and underhanded and social climber. She certainly wasn't a sweet sort of lovely victim or anything. Far from it. She's no shrinking violet. And when she had the king's ear and influence, she used it ruthlessly for her own advantage and to punish people that she just didn't like, and things did, of course, turn, and then she was on her hands and knees begging for help from people who she'd previously treated like shit. Anyway, Anne Boleyn was beheaded. Elizabeth was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, and later on, there's not a whole lot of doubt of the parentage there. But it went through a series of twists and turns. First, Elizabeth was declared a bastard and was not, was born out of a legal proper marriage, or was the child of one of Anne Boleyn's alleged lovers, or so she was not entitled to be an heir to the throne. Then she was, and then she wasn't, and she was again, and it was all over the place. So Elizabeth was, would have been from a young child quite uncertain as to about whether or not she was the heir to the throne, or whether or not they're going to, take her out the back and shoot her or something like that. Now, on top of that, there are a lot of religious conflicts at the time between Catholics and Protestants. Henry VIII had gone from Catholicism to the Protestant religions, declaring himself, in effect, the head of the church, and thus his own omnipotence. And he had support from, or indirect support, I guess, from people like Martin Luther in Germany, and other Sweden and so on, that were embracing the Protestant religion. So when Henry VIII died, that Catholic Protestant drama was still going on, so it hadn't been fully settled. Now, when Henry VIII died, the next in line for the throne was Mary, who was the daughter of Henry's first wife, and and she was made queen. And I just want to talk a little bit about succession. Now, England had, over the previous few hundred years, they'd had numerous wars of succession, including how the Tudor dynasty, Henry VII, Henry VIII's father, came to the throne. There was much drama and conflict, every time a monarch died, there was multiple claimants to the throne, some having very weak claims, others having plausible claims, and that it would often result in effect, civil war. And various continental powers, such as the Spanish and the French and so on, would support one candidate or another on the basis that they would then gain a favourable position in court should their candidate get up and win. So because of these external, if you like, election interference, because of this external meddling, then there was a lot more drama, and the wars were a lot more drawn out than they necessarily needed to be. So this was something the aristocratic class remembered all too well, and they wanted to avoid it. So Mary died of cancer not that long after coming to the throne, and her premiership had been an absolute disaster. Costly foreign wars, all sorts of carry on, wasteful and extravagant spending. She'd married one of the princes of the Spanish court, and that didn't work out well at all. And so Mary was also wanting to reintroduce Catholicism to England. So Protestants were viewed as heretics. They were burned at the stake and these sort of things. So it was an unpleasant time, and people were glad to see the back of Mary when she died. So now Elizabeth was known to have Protestant, leanings, and so she was, I think, about 25 when she came to the throne. So it was an unexpected choice. I don't think she really knew until almost the last minute that she was actually the queen. Because the aristocrats effectively were deciding it. They were looking at it from the point of view, what can we do to have the least drama, the least convulsions, the least carry on? And Elizabeth was the best option they had out of the various options that they considered, and that other claimants were putting their hand up for. So they thought, no, Elizabeth is the best. She's unmarried. She's got no foreign affiliations. She's got no loyalties to any, French or Spanish guys. So we need to use her. That's the best way to get stability and continuity in England. So they chose her for that. They could have cast her aside quite easily, but she offered that, and again, the favourite to Protestant. Now, Elizabeth had been, again, she was 25 when she became queen. She'd been brought up in a household that wasn't lavish and in its expenditure, so she kept very careful records of expenditure. She hadn't, had a lot of money to throw around. Now she would get, presents here and there, but she wasn't showered in money and gifts as other young monarchs or queens or kings in training or in waiting were. But she had quite an intense education in, Greek and Latin and all sorts of things, French, and she was a polyglot. She spoke multiple languages and could write and read in them as well. So she was quite an accomplished student in the languages, and also had one thing about Elizabeth is they made sure she had good quality lecturers, and because she wasn't ever considered as really a serious contender for the throne, the education she had was wide and broad, and if you like, it took in subjects that someone being trained specifically for, being a king or a queen maybe wouldn't have got. So that indirectly benefited her, giving her maybe a broader view of things than she might have otherwise had. So she was very mindful of expenses. She used to keep an account book in her own hand, these sorts of things, and was very careful not to get too chummy with people for fear that if one of them fell out of favour, that she would then be accused of being their confederate in a plot against the Queen or something, something like that. So she's quite cautious there, and but she got to meet quite a few of the senior aristocrats as she went in and out of favour, and as they wanted to sort of keep her on ice just in case they needed her. So they sort of she was aware of the people around. Some hadn't treated her very well, others had, and some had treated her respectfully, and others had treated her like shit. This is the aristocrats, the privy councils, this sort of thing. So when they decided that she was the best option, it sort of involved a bit of a realignment of the power dynamics in England, and more Protestants came into position of government on the Queen's Council. Now, again, given she hadn't been trained to be a monarch, she tended to listen to the councillors and accept their advice. And she did sometimes, but rarely did she go against them. Years later, when she was sort of more confident in her position, then she did. But she lived in constant fear, some of it quite irrational, for being that she was going to get assassinated any tick of the clock, which was really not really a realistic. I suppose you couldn't say it was out of the question. There were a few attempts, but they were half-assed and ham-fisted and rando type attempts rather than organised and orchestrated. Now, the Spanish did want to get rid of her, and which is the Spanish Armada in 1588 was to get rid of Queen Elizabeth and get rid of Protestantism in England and return it to the Catholic faith. The Spanish Armada thing all fell in a screaming heap, and that didn't. And there are various other sort of indirect attempts. Now, during this time, this was sort of Spain's last gasp. They really, by the early 1600s, they ceased to be a great power, or certainly ceased to be able to run the naval and military, resources that they had been. They were getting a lot of gold and silver out of South America, and that was underwriting everything they were doing, the Spanish. But France was starting to nationalize and become a major power. This again sort of counterbalanced the power of the Spanish, and so because of the rise in French power, which also was a threat to England, by the way, but in a different way, that stopped the Spanish threat or limited the Spanish threat. The Spanish were fighting all sorts of wars across Central Europe and in the Netherlands. They were trying to run a decent-sized navy and all sorts of things. They just didn't have the funds and the resources to do it, and they were having to hire mercenaries, and they were really struggling to hold all that together. So they had to back off in their idea of invading England. And really, after the Spanish Armada was done, it was, and that was a hugely expensive exercise for Spain, and so they decided that it was just all too hard. Now, on the other side of it, there's say, well, Elizabeth never got involved in foreign wars. I mean, there were some conflicts she got involved in, helping the Protestant Dutch in the Netherlands, that sort of thing, against the Spanish. But the idea of Elizabeth not wanting to go to war wasn't really accurate. Her councillors didn't want to go to war. War was hugely expensive and a lot of uncertainty, and the British army or the English army at the time was hardly a highly skilled army and experienced, and she had no really experienced generals sort of floating around, and the Privy Council, her advisors were acutely aware of this, and well, it's just not worth going to war. Now, there was two sort of areas of warfare that would have drawn England in. One was helping other Protestant states, which they did to a limited extent. But the other was when William the Conqueror in 1066 invaded England, he also was the Duke of Normandy and various other provinces in France. So he viewed, William the Conqueror and his descendants viewed that his territories in France and England were really one of the same nation. So a lot of the wars that England was involved in on the continent with France was over this territory in Normandy that was notionally at least part of the wider or greater English sort of nation. And by the early 1500s, before Elizabeth came along, the last city, Calais, was taken by the French. And so Elizabeth and her advisors thought, look, this is just too hard. The cost of holding on to these things like Calais and Normandy, or anything, the cost of holding on to it is massive, and we're not really getting anything out of it. So why do we bother? So this idea of not going to war was really a natural extension of various geopolitics that were going on at the time. And again, the advice from her counsellors. Now, her counsellors were saying, let's sort of focus on trade. And this was really them. They were doing it. So Sir Walter Raleigh and Francis Drake, those sort of guys going along. This is coming back to Virginia in the United States. These were things that that her counsellors and various seafarers were saying. Look how well the Spanish are doing in South America. We need to have our own trading sort of set up here. Why don't we go into the Americas where no other European power is and start building plantations and developing trade there? So that was really where the emphasis came. And again, Elizabeth was not against it, but Elizabeth was being effectively pushed into it by the advisors. Now, these sort of swoon, starry-eyed sort of Elizabeth is brilliant type thing, they make out that it was all her doing, and she conceived it, and she knew it was going to be fantastic, and she was the builder of the British Empire. That's bullshit, absolute bullshit. Now, coming to Elizabeth as a person, she's very highly strung and was prone to have tantrum upon tantrum and then faint. She'd have a tantrum and she'd faint, just fall on the floor, and there'd be much drama and doctors being called and all sorts of things like that. So she was certainly not somewhat of robust disposition. She was always changing her mind. If she would give orders for, say, a ship to sail, the ship would often cast off even when the tides weren't favourable, because Elizabeth would often have multiple riders in transit to the port. One rider saying, horse rider with a message, one rider saying, no, don't leave, I countermand the order. And another rider just a few miles behind saying, no, I countermand the countermanding. Another rider, it was that insane. So her counsellors would say to foreign diplomats and the like, look, talk to the Queen and smile at her, but then come to us if you really want to have a decision made, because she was incapable of making a decision, or she would procrastinate for so long that the crisis or whatever it was she's meant to make a decision on had passed anyway, or that had been overtaken by other events. This, the feminists try to say, is her brilliance and intuition and genius, and that it's nothing like it at all. She just couldn't make a fucking decision. Now, in terms of how she behaved, she loved and spent a lot of time engaging in animal cruelty. She seemed to really get off on this. She liked watching savage dogs tear bears to pieces, like it's called bear baiting. Watch savage dogs tearing bears to pieces, and they pull the claws out from the bear's paws and they chain it up, the bear, so it couldn't really fight back, and then they set savage dogs on it. Now, how that can be viewed as entertainment is quite beyond me. But there you go. She also liked to watch savage dogs tearing deers to pieces. So they'd have what would be the equivalent today, I suppose, of a greyhound, and they would go and chase after this terrified deer, pull them down, pull the exhausted deer down, just tear them to pieces. Dogs wouldn't kill them though; they just tear the ears off and tear half the face off. And Elizabeth loved to watch this. Again, I mean, even taking into account the times and in any society where life expectancy is low and the death rate is high, through people lucky to live past 30, that sort of thing, there tends to be this casual attitude towards death and watching suffering and cruelty. Bear baiting goes on in Pakistan, for example, today, and the argument for it is that, hey, I've had 10 children, 5 of whom have died before they're 2 years old. Why should I care if some bear gets torn to pieces by dogs? That type of thing. So, and if the deer wasn't dead from all the, either terrified to death or half torn to death, Elizabeth liked jumping off the horse, getting a knife and stabbing it in the neck until it died. So this is the sort of, again, even allowing for the times and the brutality of the times, that seems a very odd way of going about things. Not that others didn't do it, but you think she'd sort of stand back a little bit from that type of behaviour, being the monarch. And all that. So in terms of day-to-day behaviour, she was careful with money. Even when the sailors that defended Britain during the time of the Spanish Armada attack, she refused to pay them the money she'd agreed to pay them, saying that that she couldn't afford it, that sort of thing. I mean, that's an outrageous breach of trust to your loyal citizens, I believe. So she was quite happy to enter into agreements and arrangements to pay somebody this or do this and do that, and then renege on it, and did so without a second's thought. So, whatever success that England had during the time, sure, they didn't get involved in foreign wars, but that wasn't Elizabeth's decision. That was the geopolitics of the time, and that there weren't really any wars that they wanted or were worthwhile getting involved in, other than helping Protestants like with the Netherlands, which ended up in disaster anyway. And now, when Elizabeth had come to the throne, British finances and so on were in a parlous state. It was not good. So the only place you could go was up, and all she had to do, and all the councillors had to do, and they advised us, was just not go to war, and just be a little bit more sharpen up the tax collection thing. Now, she also had failings, like she liked to be surrounded by young, attractive people. So, as in part of her sort of entourage, but people that would flatter her and so on. And she fancied herself as a bit of a hot babe, and was quite vain in that regard. And so she liked to surround herself with young, attractive young women and attractive young men. But she used to demand that the men kept saying that, "Oh, you're the most attractive. None of those other women are attractive. You're the hot piece of ass around here." So, and she would do things like, it was a guy that was a youngish guy who was had some role in the household, and it was now, but he had a riding accident, and one of his front teeth got knocked out, and she decided that missing front tooth made him so ugly that he couldn't, or unattractive rather, that he wasn't allowed to stay in her employ. And that's pretty brutal. Maybe the guy wasn't that good at his job. And she had other things too when she was looking at hiring people or having people that may be not necessarily close to her. They may have just looked after her horses or looked after the gardens or something like that. She would do things like demand that they would come close to her and talk to her intimately, so she could tell if they had bad breath. And they were dismissed as well. You're only allowed to have sweet breath. And these are people that she's not going to be intimate with. They're not going to be lovers or close confidants or something like that. So they're very vain, and I think she was just fortunate to come along in those times. And the council, that some of the people that she picked in the council, by the way, it wasn't all councillors that installed there. She was, I think, she was reasonably fortunate that that those councillors, I mean, there's some were put to death, and they're part of a rather half-assed insurrection or something like that. But she did have on the main a pretty decent array of councillors, and they were firm on, don't go to war, let's set up a trading empire. And those things meant that the exchequer, the finances of England were restored and put in pretty decent order, even though Elizabeth was quite spendthrift. You look at some of their annual expenditures, things like her household, they would go through 400,000 chickens, things like that. I mean, and the household wasn't that big, so how much I can't see how they could have spent the sort of money that they did. She liked to go travelling around, not too far, say 2 or 3 days ride, and this is baggage train type ride from London. So she didn't want to go too far, and so the baggage train could go for kilometres, if so be, hundreds of carts. And she demanded that the full household was brought along, her favourite beer and her favourite food, and this and that. And the next thing was brought along, and demanded. It was quite petty, and would stamp her foot and have a little tanty if she can get her own way, that sort of stuff. But again, the reason the people around to put up with this is because A, there was no heir, there was no one else to take the throne. So if Elizabeth went, there was no legitimate heir to the throne, rather, even Queen Mary of Scotland, but that wasn't considered to be workable for the Protestant Catholic business. So if they got rid of Elizabeth, then the whole place would have plunged into chaos. And even though the Lords would roll their eyes and think, why do we put up with this woman? It was still a more stable, more continuity than any of the other options that were around. And so that's why they stayed with her, even though they were less than enamoured of her female behaviour. So this idea that she was ushered in a golden age and she was, this strong woman, it's all utter total bullshit. And she's just been picked as a feminist icon, while Winston Churchill and Admiral Nelson and all those sort of people are written off as fascists and Nazis and the like. So now, to sort of give you an idea of how much the British aristocracy wanted continuity and stability, when Elizabeth died, and there was no heir, when Elizabeth died, I think it was in like 1603, the British aristocracy gave the throne to King James of Scotland. So he became the King of England and Scotland. So it was, later on formalised as the Union of the Crowns. But now the reason for this was that France and Spain were constantly intriguing and stirring up things in Scotland and Ireland, for that matter, and therefore the idea of neutralising Scotland as a potential threat, because if the British got embroiled if the English got embroiled in a war with like France or Spain or something, then they just simply wouldn't have the resources to fight a battle on two fronts if Scotland decided to enter the war on the French side. So they went with the Union of the Crowns, but it shows how desperate they were for stability and continuity, and how much they were prepared to go out of their way to ensure that continuity. And really, Elizabeth was a product of that, and not was a great monarch, not was a great administrator or a great leader or anything like that. Far from it. Now, she did manage to keep her popularity with the people, this going around, and was quite again, with her advisors, quite a propagandist, riding in extravagant royal coaches, wearing extravagant jeweled costumes and the like. And she was, from all accounts, quite a popular monarch, certainly on a relative basis, at least. And this was also something that swayed the Privy Council. Her advisors said, "Well, look, she's giving stability and continuity by her mere existence, and she's also popular with the common people. This is all for the good. This is all for stability and continuity, and so on, and makes it less likely there's going to be any uprisings or things of that nature." So that's the background to Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth there, and I hope that's given a well-rounded sort of view of what was going on at the time, and the role Queen Elizabeth I played in those times. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.